Hello there, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. When episode 4 of Skeleton Crew begins, spoiler alert, I immediately noticed that something was wrong. You see, the kids were supposed to be finally returning home to the planet of At Atinn.
Just when things were starting to get fun.
But the Star Wars nerd in me picked up two very strange things about this planet. One, where was the barrier, this famous barrier that keeps At Atinn safe from outsiders?
Starships are not permitted to enter or leave.
You could be out past the barrier by now!
Breaching the barrier is a serious violation.
What exactly is the barrier? Well, we're given a few clues in previous episodes. You can even physically see it in the sky very clearly in the first episode of the show. And then there's this description.
Tell me, what does this barrier look like? You see it at night. It's cloudy, like a swirl. Nebula gases.
So a nebula is essentially a cloud of gases and material that collects in the spaces between stars. It's kind of like all the salt and grease that collects on your fingers when you put potato chips in your mouth. Known as star nurseries, this is where stars gather material and are born, and also where stars go to die. Nebulas, depending on what they're made out of, can serve as a deterrent for navigation or even communications or any kind of signals, now that I think about it. They are, in fact, the perfect smokescreen in the cosmic landscape, perfect for hiding entire planets like At Atinn. And so it's very clear to me that the planet they were flying to in episode 4 wasn't At Atinn, because the sky, the space around the planet was completely clear. There was no nebula. And so I thought maybe this is another planet that might be similar to At Atinn. Another one of the jewel worlds that the Owl Lady mistakenly sent them to. But then a second thing caught my eye. A series of relatively damaged satellites that looked quite familiar to me, with their little needle-like apparatuses. You see, in the Star Wars galaxy, there are plenty of different types of satellites. You have defense stations, you have communication satellites, and everything in between. But here's the thing, we rarely ever see satellites in Star Wars, and what we do see them in canon, especially in this shape, with that focusing dish and that kind of pointy sharp thing at the end, it's usually when people are referring to something known as Operation Cinder. Those of you who know about the late Imperial period might be familiar with this term. See, during Emperor Palpatine's reign, being the paranoid and vindictive individual that he was, he set up a series of operations known as the Contingency Plan in case he passes. A big part of this plan was to ensure the survival of portions of the Empire, which would be reborn at a later date by Emperor Palpatine. And the other half of this contingency plan was all about the destruction of the Empire's military capabilities and holdings, so that the New Republic inherited a completely destroyed wasteland. Think of it as Palpatine's scorched earth policy, but from the grave. Like I said, this guy is a real piece of work. If he can't have the galaxy, well then no one can. Now, one of the most evil parts of Palpatine's contingency plan was something known as Operation Cinder. You see, Palpatine not only wanted to keep valuable resources out of the hands of his enemies, he also wanted to punish his own subjects. Operation Cinder was basically a series of orbital bombardment campaigns that would be carried out against some of the most populated and prosperous worlds in the galaxy. These operations were carried out by his most loyal and fanatic officers, usually indoctrinated ISB agents. They would use a series of climate array devices, which are basically the satellites I believe we see in episode 4, and they would basically create super hurricanes on these planets, which would literally smash everything on the surface of the planet, killing everyone and destroying entire cities, but leaving the resources relatively unscathed for Palpatine's return. That's what I believe happened to At Achrann. And if you take a look a little more closely at the details, it's not just the satellites, but what's happened on the planet's surface, you'll start to see that maybe this is true. And the sad thing about Operation Cinder was they weren't just targeting, worlds with rebel activity and dissidents. They were targeting worlds where active Imperial forces were still fighting against the rebellion. That's why Migs Mayfield hates the Empire so much. He was fighting on burning Conan when Operation Cinder was basically dropped right on top of his head. Sure, it killed all the rebel forces on the planet, but it also took out an entire division of Imperial Army troopers. Worlds like Naboo, the home world of Palpatine, was also attacked, but luckily in that one case, disaster was thwarted. Even completely loyal Imperial heartland worlds like Vardos weren't spared the devastation. Such was the cruelty of this operation. And so I believe what we're seeing on At Achrann is the result of this Operation Cinder. And it makes sense. At Achrann is a treasure world. A completely beautiful and idyllic place to live, probably full of resources with a high human capital society, making the perfect place to strike for a vindictive Palpatine. And so this is why At Achrann is not only in ruins, but seems to have severe weather pattern changes, including a perpetual fog and very weird looking weather systems from orbit. Operation Cinder basically created these massive hurricanes, much larger than the Category 5 storms we have here on Earth, and these storms would last for a very long and unnatural time, and they would also be able to maintain their momentum on land, something that doesn't really happen with natural hurricanes. And what you'll have is intense thunderstorms and lightning storms that cause fires. You'll have intense wind blowing everything around, coastal flooding, maybe debris entering higher into the atmosphere, blocking out the sun. Who knows? I mean, this is extremely intense weather destruction, basically. It's fitting that At Achrann is named after Akron, Ohio, another desolate area of the galaxy that might have been named for the river that takes the deceased to Hades. It's all very hellish, this landscape. You kind of don't want to be here. Now, you might be thinking, hey, weren't the Republic Jewel worlds hidden from the rest of the galaxy? How could the Empire know about At Achrann? Well, take a look at the armor and weapons used by these tribal factions on this planet, including what clearly is an E-11 blaster and also an Imperial Army trooper. Actually, judging by the amount of Imperial Army troopers we see here, I think it's very likely that the Empire at one point occupied At Achrann. Another clue that the Empire arrived on this planet is the massive statue the kids run into. At first, the kids recognized At Achrann as their own home, At Atinn. I actually thought maybe this was like a time warp. They, skip forward in time or something like that. But then, again, these dual worlds were probably created in a template, and so they recognized the homes, the civic buildings, the schools. The one thing they didn't recognize, however, was that statue.
I wonder who this guy was. Maybe he was the leader of this planet.
So it seems to me on At Atinn, they didn't have statues like this. This is probably why At Atinn is less dystopian than these other planets, because when people start erecting statues of themselves, well, it's usually not good. I mean, it's one thing if someone else built a statue of you because you did something awesome, like defeating the vampire threat that essentially took over the southern states during the Civil War. If you're building a statue of yourself, you're probably pretty corrupt, in control of a lot of resources. Maybe you're an authoritarian dictator. My guess would be that the individual that is depicted here is maybe an Imperial governor or a Moff. Could also be Palpatine, or maybe an Imperial warlord in the latter days of the Galactic Civil War. Whatever happened here, it seems like the utopia of At Achrann was severely interrupted. Maybe when outside forces arrived on the planet and occupied the planet, like the Empire, bringing with them weapons and vehicles like that hover tank. Now that I think about it, that hover tank looks like a mix between an AAT and also a Republic Saber hover tank, although the latter is far more lower profile and much faster moving. Well, actually, that hover tank also has a higher profile and the more rugged lines of Imperial designs, like something out of Rothana Heavy Engineering or Quad System Engineering. Maybe this is an Imperial war machine, an Imperial hover tank we just haven't seen before. And we don't just see Imperial helmets, we also see what looks like Rebel Pathfinder helmets, which have a much more NATO-like silhouette. Now, as we enter the center of the city, it's clear that the city is pockmarked with what looks like energy blasts, so there seems to have been some kind of large-scale conflict that took place here. It's possible that this planet was involved in the Clone Wars. It's possible that this planet was involved also in the Galactic Civil War. I mean, judging by the equipment and armor we're seeing, I think the latter is probably closer to the truth. If you think about it, it makes perfect sense that Palpatine would know about these dual worlds as the Chancellor of the Republic. He had access to a lot of information, and even if At Achrann was a secret from even the Chancellor, he had ways and means to figure things out. I mean, Palpatine spent a lot of his resources and credits exploring ancient artifacts and uncovering the secrets of the galaxy. The Jewels of the Republic would definitely be something that he was interested in. This also explains maybe why At Atinn is so isolated and cut off from the rest of the galaxy and has such a stringent rule about people leaving and arriving. Maybe at one point in time, these dual worlds did maintain limited contact with the outside world. Maybe they still contacted each other and the Republic. You know, we talked about how this might have all been a social experiment to create utopia. And so it makes sense that these worlds would report back their findings to some kind of central, scientific organization. But then the destruction of all of At Attinn's sister planets might have forced the planet to take extreme measures and basically lock itself away from the rest of the galaxy. Now the question is, if the rebel forces did fight the Empire on At Achrann, like during the Mid-Rim Offensive or something like that, then why didn't the New Republic step in later on and help basically stabilize the world? It's something they probably would have done. Well, that actually makes the Operation Cinder narrative far more likely of a candidate for the destruction of this planet. Now, maybe those helmets we talked about aren't actually from the Rebel Alliance. Maybe these are older helmets that were sold to warlords on this planet in exchange for hides, as that one warlord was talking about.
Sadly, we do not concern ourselves with off-worlders beyond trading hides for ammunition.
And the real reason why these people are equipped and running around with old Imperial Army trooper helmets was that this was a world that was kept secret by Palpatine and the Empire. And so when he carried Operation Cinder on the planet, no one in the New Republic knew about it, and the people we see in the show are basically the descendants of the survivors of that incident. An incident that probably killed a large number of Imperial Army troopers, which is why their equipment is everywhere. It should be noted, however, the show only takes place like a decade after the Empire collapses and, 3 decades after Palpatine takes over. One does get the general sense that all these people on At Achrann, including the older adults, have been born into this post-apocalyptic wasteland. There's no talk about what life was like before when things were good and stable, which means they would have been living in this chaotic way for far longer than a few decades. Which means it's very, very possible that this world was destroyed long before Palpatine ever took control. Maybe this was the result of At Achrann's failed utopian social experiment. After all, we talk about how At Atinn is kind of dystopian in nature. And generally speaking, when people try to create these utopian societies, they go too extreme in one way or another, and they become the very evil they were trying to stave off by creating this utopian society. Generally speaking, anyone who promises to create utopia should be treated with suspicion, because it almost never ends well. And so maybe that's what this world is. It's just a failed experiment where society collapses and the people have completely turned on each other. And maybe this is a warning to these kids. Maybe they are the key to preventing this from happening to their own beloved homeworld. Anyway, guys, let me know in the comment section below what you guys think about my theory. Also, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy. I'll see you next time.